Hello, my darling. Thank you for joining me today. I have something of an exciting treat, a multi-chapter story that you probably remember from your childhood. It is called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it was written by Lewis Carroll in 1865. This will be a multi-part series, so if you happen to fall asleep early on, don't worry. There will be plenty to listen to coming up. Before we begin, I would like for you to relax, take a deep breath in, and let it out slowly. And if you'd like, you can close your eyes as I read to you. Chapter 1. Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into her sister's book, but it had no pictures or conversations. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and slow-minded, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran very close by. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it was so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit itself, as he exclaimed, oh dear, I shall be late." When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this, but at the time this all seemed quite natural. When the rabbit actually took a watch out of his waistcoat pocket and looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice jumped to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat or a watch to take out of it. And, burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and fortunately was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under a ledge. In another moment, down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she would get out again. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down a very deep well. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her and wonder what was going to happen next. First, she tried to take a look down and make out where she was falling, but it was too dark to see anything. And then she looked at the sides of the well and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed it and saw that it was labeled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing somebody, so she managed to put it into one of the cupboards as she fell fast down next to it. Well, thought Alice to herself. After such a fall as this, I shall think nothing of tumbling down the stairs. How brave they'll all think of me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it, even if I fell off the top of my house. This was very likely true. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she asked aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see. That would be about 4,000 miles down, I think. For, you see, Alice had learned several things of this sort in her lessons in the schoolroom, and though this was not a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge, as there was no one to listen to her, still, she felt it was a good practice to say it out loud. Yes, that's about the right distance. But then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've gotten to. Alice, of course, had no idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but thought they were nice, grand words to say. Presently, she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads pointed downwards. The antipathies, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as she didn't think that sounded like the right word at all. But I shall have to ask them what the name of their country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And she tried to curtsy as she spoke. Fancy curtsying as you're falling through the air. Do you think you could manage it? And what an ignorant little girl she'll think me for asking. No, it'll never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Down, down, down. Alice kept falling. There was nothing else to do, so Alice soon began talking again. Dinah'll miss me very much tonight, I should think. Dinah was her cat. I hope they'll remember her saucer of milk at tea time. Dinah, my dear, I wish you were down here with me. There are no mice in the air, I'm afraid, but you might catch a bat, and that's very much like a mouse, you know. But do cats eat bats, I wonder? And here Alice began to get rather sleepy, and she went on saying to herself, in a dreamy sort of way, do cats eat bats? Do cats eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? For you see, she couldn't answer either question, so it didn't much matter which way she put it. She felt that she was dozing off, and had just begun to dream that she was walking hand in hand with Dinah, and saying to her very earnestly, Now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Did you ever eat a bat? When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and her fall was over. Alice was not hurt, and she jumped up on her feet in a moment. She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Before her was another long passage, and the white rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. There was not a moment to be lost. Away went Alice like the wind, and was just in time to hear it say, as it turned a corner, Oh, my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting. She was close behind the rabbit, but the rabbit ran faster, and soon she could no longer see him. She found herself alone in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the ceiling. There were doors all around the hall, but they all looked locked, and when Alice had been down one side and up the other. She tried every door. She walked sadly back down the middle, wondering how she would ever get out again. Suddenly, she came upon a little three-legged table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it except a tiny golden key, and Alice's first thought was that it might belong to one of the doors down the hall. But alas, either the locks were too large or the key was too small. But at any rate, this key would not open any of them. However, on the second time around, she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight, it fit. Alice opened the door and found that it led to a small passage, not much larger than a rat's hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden she had ever seen. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander about among those beds of flowers and see the cool fountains. But she could not even get her head through the doorway. And she thought, even if my head could go through, it would be of very little use to me without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could fold myself up like a telescope. I think I could, if only I knew how to begin. For you see, so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things were really impossible. There seemed to be no use in waiting by the tiny door, so she went back to the table, half hoping she might find another key, or at any rate, a book of rules for folding people up like telescopes. This time, she found a little bottle on the table, which was certainly not here before, said Alice, and around the neck of the bottle was a paper label with the words, "Drink me," beautifully printed on it in large letters. It was all very well to say, "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in any hurry. "No," she said, "I'll look around first and see whether it's marked poison." Luckily for Alice, she had read several nice little histories about children who had gotten burned or eaten up by wild beasts and other unpleasant things, all because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it for too long, and if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds. And she had never forgotten that. If you drink much from a bottle marked poison, she knew that would almost certainly disagree with her, sooner or later. However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it, and, finding it very nice, it had in fact a sort of mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. She very soon finished it off. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "I must be folding up like a telescope." And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high, and her face brightened up at the thought that she was now the right size for going through the little door into that lovely garden. First, however, she waited for a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any further. She felt a little nervous about this, for it might end, you know, said Alice to herself. It might going out altogether. It might end like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then. and she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle is like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. After a while, finding that nothing more had happened, she decided on going into the garden at once. But, alas for poor Alice, when she got to the door, she found she had forgotten her little golden key, and when she went back to the table for it, she found she could not possibly reach it. She could see it quite plainly through the glass, and she tried her best to climb up one of the legs of the table, but it was glass and slippery, and when she had tired herself out with trying, little Alice sat down on the floor and cried. "Oh, come on," she said to herself. "There's no use in crying like this. Stop crying right now." She generally gave herself very good advice, even though she seldom followed it, and sometimes she scolded herself so severely as to bring tears into her own eyes. And once she remembered trying to hit her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet she was playing against herself, for this curious child was very fond of pretending to be two people. But it's no use now, thought poor Alice, to pretend to be two people. Why, there's hardly enough of me left to make one respectable person. Soon her eye fell on a little glass box that was sitting under the table. She opened it and found in it a very small cake, on which the words, "Eat me," were beautifully marked in crayons. "Well, I'll eat it," said Alice, "and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door. So either way, I'll get into that garden, and I don't care any more what happens." She ate a little bite and said anxiously to herself, which way will I grow? Will I shrink?" She held her hand on the top of her head to feel which way it was growing, and she was quite surprised to find that she remained the same size. To be sure, this generally happens when one eats cake, but Alice had gotten so much into the way of expecting nothing but out-of-the-way things to happen, that it seemed quite dull and silly for life to be so common now. She decided her only option was to finish eating the cake, and she did. Chapter 2. The Pool of Tears. "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. "Look at me. Now I'm growing like the largest telescope there ever was. Goodbye, feet." For when she looked down at her feet, they seemed to be almost out of sight. They were getting so far off. "Oh, my poor little feet. I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears. I'm sure I shan't be able. I shall be a great deal too far off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best way you can. But I must be kind to them," thought Alice, "or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Let me see. I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas." And she went on planning to herself how she would manage it. They must go by the carrier, she thought, and how funny it'll seem, sending presents to one's own feet, and how odd the directions will look. Alice's right foot, hearthrug near the fender, with all of Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense I'm talking. Just then, her head struck against the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the golden little key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice! It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look through into the garden with one eye, but to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Alice. "The A great girl like you, to go on crying in this way. Stop this moment, I tell you." But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears until there was a large pool all around her, about 4 inches deep and reaching halfway down the hall. After a time, she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance, and she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting along in a great hurry, muttering to himself, "Oh, the Queen! The Queen! Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask anyone for help. So when the rabbit came near, she began in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit was so startled, he dropped the white gloves and fan and scurried away into the darkness as quickly as he could. Alice grabbed the fan and the gloves and, as the hall was very hot, kept fanning herself all the time she went on talking. "Dear, dear, how queer everything is today. And yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've been changed in the night. Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Now that's a great puzzle." And she began thinking over all the children she knew that were the same age as herself, to see if she could have been changed into any of them. She tried to remember her lessons and said, "How doth the little—" And she crossed her hands on her lap as if she were actually saying her lessons and began to repeat it. But her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come as they used to do. "How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcome little fishes in, with gently smiling jaws." "Now wait, I'm sure those are not the right words," said poor Alice, and her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. "I must be stupid after all. I might be Mabel. I shall have to go and live in her tiny little house and have no toys to play with, and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. It'll be no use putting their heads down and saying, 'Come up again, dear.' I shall only look up and say to them, 'Who am I then? Tell me first, and then if I like being that person, I might come up. If not, I'll stay down here and tell somebody else.' But, oh dear," cried Alice, with a sudden burst of tears, "I do wish they would put their heads down. I'm so very tired of being all alone here." As she said this, she looked down at her hands and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white gloves while she was talking. "How could I have done this?" she thought. "I must be growing small again." She got up and went to the table to measure herself, and found, as nearly as she could guess, that she was now only 2 feet high and going on shrieking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to avoid shrinking away altogether. "That was a narrow escape," said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. "And now for that garden." And she ran with all speed back to the little door, but alas, the little door was shut again, and the little golden key was lying on the glass table as before. "And things are worse than ever," she thought, "for I never was so small as this before, and I declare that this is not good." As she said these words, her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash, she was up to her chin in salt water. Her first idea was that she had somehow fallen into the sea, and in that case I can go back by railway, she said to herself, Alice had been to the seaside once in her life, and had come to the general conclusion that wherever you go on the English coast, you'll find a number of bathing machines in the sea, some children digging in the sand with wooden spades, then a row of locking houses, and behind them a railway station. However, she soon made out that she was in the pool of tears which she had wept when she was 9 feet high. "Oh, now I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice, as she swam about. She tried to find her way. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. Now that'll be a strange thing, to be sure. Everything is so strange today." Just then, she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first, she thought it must be a walrus or a hippopotamus, but then she remembered how small she was now, and she soon made out that it was only a mouse, and that it had slipped in just like herself. Would it be of any use now, thought Alice, to speak to this mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here, and I should think very likely that it can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying. So she began. "Oh, mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I'm very tired of swimming here." Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse, but she had never done such a thing before, though she remembered having seen in her brother's Latin grammar, "A mouse, of a mouse, to a mouse, for a mouse, oh mouse." The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively and seemed to wink with one of its little eyes, but it said nothing. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," thought Alice. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror." For, with all of her knowledge of history, Alice had no very clear notion how long ago anything had happened in history. So she began again, "Où est mon chat?" which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid that she had hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." "No, not like cats," cried the mouse. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice in a soothing tone. "But don't be angry about it. And yet, I wish I could show you our cat Dinah. I think you'd fancy cats if you could only see her. She's such a dear, quiet thing." Alice went on, half to herself, as she swam lazily about in the pool. "And Dinah will sit purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face. And she is such a nice, soft thing to pet. And she is such a capital one for catching mice." Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice again, for this time the mouse was bristling all over, and she felt certain it must be really offended. "We won't talk about her any more, if you'd rather not." "We indeed," cried the mouse, who was trembling down to the end of his tail, "as if I would talk about such a subject. Our family always hated cats. Nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear that name again." Oh, I won't indeed," said Alice in a great hurry to change the subject of conversation. "Are you fond of dogs?" The mouse did not answer, so Alice went on eagerly. "There is such a nice little dog near our house. I would love to show you. He's a bright-eyed terrier with such long curly brown hair, and he'll fetch things when you throw them, and he'll sit up and beg for his dinner and all sorts of things. And he belongs to this farmer, you know, and he says his dog is so useful, he's worth 100 pounds. He says the dog kills all of the rats and, oh dear, Alice. I'm afraid I've offended you again. For the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as he could go, and he made quite a commotion in the pool. She called softly after him, "Mouse dear, please come back again. We won't talk about cats or dogs if you don't like them." When the mouse heard this, he turned around and swam slowly back to her. His face was quite pale, with passion, Alice thought, and he said to her in a low, trembling voice, "Let us get to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is that I hate cats and dogs." It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with the birds and animals that had fallen in. There was a duck, and a dodo, and a lory, and an eaglet, and many other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to shore. Chapter 3. A Caucus Race and a Long Tail. They were indeed a strange-looking party that assembled on the bank, the birds with ragged feathers, the animals with their fur clinging close to them, and all dripping wet, cross, and uncomfortable. The first question, of course, was how to get dry again. They had a consultation about this, and after a few minutes it seemed quite natural to Alice to find herself talking with them, as if she had known them all of her life. Indeed, she had quite a long argument with the lory, who at last turned sulky and would only say, "I am older than you and must know better." And this Alice would not allow. She demanded to know how old he was, and, as the lory positively refused to tell his age, there was no more to be said. At last, the mouse, who seemed to be a person of authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down at once, in a large ring, with the mouse in the middle. Alice kept her eyes anxiously fixed on the mouse, for she felt sure she would catch a bad cold if she did not get dry very soon. "Excuse me," said the mouse, with an important air. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please." William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders, and had been of late much accustomed to conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. "Ah," said the lory, with a shiver. "I beg your pardon," said the mouse. He frowned, but remained polite. "Did you speak?" "Not I," said the lory hastily. "Well, I thought you did," said the mouse. "I will proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable. "Found what?" said the duck. "Found it," said the mouse. "Of course, you all know what it means." "I know well enough what it means when I find the thing," said the duck. "It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" The mouse did not notice this question, but he hurriedly went on. "Found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate, but the insolence of his Normans. "How are you getting on now, my dear?" he continued, turning towards Alice. "Well, I'm as wet as ever," said Alice. "It doesn't seem to dry me at all." "Well, in that case," said the Dodo, "I move that the meeting adjourn. It's time for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies." "Speak English," said the Eaglet. "I don't know the meaning of half of those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the Eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile, while some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the Dodo, now slightly offended, "was that the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race." "Okay," said Alice, "what is a caucus race?" Not that she much wanted to know, but the Dodo had paused, as if he thought somebody ought to speak, and no one else seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the Dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. And you, dear reader, might like to try the same thing yourself some winter day, and I will tell you how the Dodo managed it. First, the Dodo marked out a race course in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't actually matter, said the Dodo. And then all the party were placed along the course, here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3, and away, but they began running when they liked and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running for about a half an hour, they were quite dry again, and suddenly the Dodo called out, "Hey, the race is over!" And they all crowded around him, panting and asking, "Well, who has won?" This question the Dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought, and he sat for a long time with one finger pressed against his forehead. This is the position in which you usually see Shakespeare in the pictures of him. The rest of the animals waited in silence until at last the Dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes. But who is to give us these prizes?" Quite a chorus of voices asked. "Why, she, of course," said the Dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger. The whole party at once crowded around her, calling out in a confused way, "Prizes, right? It's time for prizes." Alice had no idea what to do, and in despair, she put her hand into her pocket and pulled out a box of comfits. Luckily, the salt water had not gotten into them. She handed the comfits round as prizes, and there was exactly one piece for every animal. "But she must have a prize herself, you know," said the Mouse. "Well, of course," said the Dodo. "Well, girl, what else have you got in your pocket?" Alice sighed. "I have a thimble." "Hand it over here," said the Dodo. Then they all crowded around once more, while the Dodo solemnly presented the thimble and said, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble." When he had finished his short speech, all of the animals gave a cheer. Alice thought the whole thing very absurd, but they all looked so serious that she did not dare to laugh, and, as she could not think of anything to say, she simply bowed and took the thimble and looked as solemn as she could. The next thing to do was to eat the comfits. This caused some noise and confusion, The large birds complained that they could not taste theirs, and the small ones choked and had to be patted on the back. However, it was over at last, and they sat down again in a ring and begged the mouse to tell them more stories. "You promised to tell me your history, you know," said Alice, "and why it is that you hate C's and D's," she added in a whisper. She was afraid to offend the mouse again. "Well, mine is a long and sad tale," said the mouse. "It is a long tale, certainly," said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse's tail. "But why do you call it sad?" And she kept on puzzling about this while the mouse was speaking, and her idea of the tale was something like this. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take denial. We must have a trial. For really, this morning, I've nothing to do," said the mouse to the cur. "Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, we'd be wasting our breath." "I'll be judge, I'll be jury," said the cunning old Fury. "I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death." "You are not attending," said the mouse to Alice severely. "What are you thinking of?" I beg your pardon," said Alice very humbly. "You had got to the fifth bend, I think?" "I had not," cried the mouse, sharply and angrily. "A knot," said Alice, always ready to make herself useful. She looked about anxiously. "I can help you undo the knot." "This is absurd," said the mouse, getting up and walking away. "You insult me by talking such nonsense." "Well, I didn't mean it," pleaded Alice. "But you're so easily offended, you know." The mouse growled in reply. "But please come back and finish your story." "Yes, please do," cried the others. But the mouse only shook its head impatiently and walked away a little quicker. "Well, what a pity it wouldn't stay," sighed the Lory, as soon as it was quite out of sight. An old crab took the opportunity of saying to her daughter, "Ah, my dear, let this be a lesson to you never to lose your temper." "Hold your tongue, mother," said the young crab, a little snappishly. "You're enough to try the patience of an oyster." Alice gave a big sigh. "I wish I had Dinah here." She addressed no one in particular. She'd fetch the mouse right back. "And who is Dinah, if I might venture to ask the question?" said the Lory. Alice replied eagerly, for she was always ready to talk about her beloved cat. "Dinah's my cat, and she's such a capital one for catching mice, and you can't think. And oh, I wish you could see her catch birds. She'll eat a little bird as soon as she'll look at it." This speech caused a remarkable sensation among the party. Some of the birds hurried off at once. One old magpie began wrapping itself up very carefully and remarked, "I really must be getting home. The night air doesn't suit my throat." A canary called out in a trembling voice to his children, "Come away, my dears. It's high time we were all in bed." On various pretexts they all moved away, and Alice was soon left all alone. "Oh, how I wish I hadn't mentioned Dinah," she said to herself in a melancholy tone. "No one seems to like her down here, and I know she's the best cat in the world. Oh, my dear Dinah, I wonder if I shall ever see you ever again. here, poor Alice began to cry again, for she felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a little while, however, she again heard a little pattering of footsteps in the distance, and she looked up eagerly, half hoping that the mouse had changed his mind and was coming back to finish his story. Chapter 4. The Rabbit Sends in a Little Bill. It was the White Rabbit, trotting slowly back again and looking anxiously about as it went, as if it had lost something, and Alice heard it muttering to itself, "The Queen, the Queen! Oh, my dear paws! Oh, my fur and whiskers! She'll get me executed, as sure as ferrets are ferrets. Where can I have dropped them, I wonder?" Alice guessed in a moment that the rabbit was looking for the fan and the pair of white gloves, and she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them, but they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed since her swim in the pool, and the great hall, which held the glass table and the little door, had vanished completely. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice as she went hunting about, and he called out to her in an angry tone, "Why, Marianne, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick now!" And Alice was so much frightened that she ran off at once in the direction he pointed to, without even trying to explain the mistake he had made. "He took me for his housemaid," she said to herself as she ran. "How surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am. But I'd better take him his fan and gloves. That is, if I can find them." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house. On the door was a silver plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking and hurried upstairs, in great fear lest she should meet the real Marianne and be turned out of the house before she had found the fan and the gloves. "How strange it seems," said Alice to herself, "to be going on errands for a rabbit. I suppose Dinah will be sending me on errands next." And she began fancying the sort of thing that would happen. "Miss Alice, come here directly and get ready for your walk. Coming in a moment, Dinah. But I've got to see that the mouse doesn't get out. Only, I don't think," Alice went on, "that they'd let Dinah stop in the house if she began ordering people around like that." By this time, she had found her way into a tidy little room with a table in the window, and on it, as she had hoped, was a fan and 3 pairs of tiny white gloves. She picked up the fan and a pair of the gloves, and was just going to leave the room when her eye fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking-glass. There was no label this time with the words, "Drink me," but nevertheless she uncorked it and put it to her lips. "I know something interesting is sure to happen," she said to herself, "whenever I eat or drink anything, so let's just see what this little bottle does. I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for I really am quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." And it did so indeed, and much sooner than she had expected. Before she had drank half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling, and she had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, "That's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more. As it is, I can't get out of the door. I wish I hadn't drank quite so much, but alas, it was too late to wish that." She went on growing and growing, and very soon she had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute there was not even room for this. and as she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door and the other curled round her head, still she kept on growing, and, as a last resource, she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney and said to herself, "Well, now I can do no more. Whatever happens, but what will become of me?" Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still, it was very uncomfortable, and as there seemed to be no sort of chance of her ever getting out of the room again, she felt tears spring into her eyes. It was so much more pleasant at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down that rabbit hole. And yet, it's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied the kind of thing that would never happen. And now, here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me. That there ought. And when I grow up, maybe I'll write that book. She laughed to herself. But I'm grown up now. Although, at least there's no more room to grow any larger here. But then, thought Alice, shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort one way, never to be an old woman. But then, always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that. Oh, you foolish girl, she answered herself. How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for lesson books. And so she went on, taking first one side and then the other, and making quite a conversation of it all together. But after a few minutes, she heard a voice outside, and she stopped to listen. "Marianne, Marianne," said the voice, "fetch me my gloves this moment." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Alice knew it was a white rabbit coming to look for her, and she trembled until she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now 1,000 times larger than the rabbit, and had no reason to be afraid of him any longer. Presently, the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but as the door opened inwards, and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard him say to himself, "Then I'll go round and I'll get in the window." "No, you won't," thought Alice, and after waiting until she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall, and a crash of broken glass. From this, she concluded that it was just possible the rabbit had fallen into the cucumber frame, or something of the sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's voice. "Pat, Pat, where are you?" And then a voice she had never heard before. "Sure then, I'm here, digging for apples, Your Honor." "Digging for apples, indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come and help me out of this." Sounds of more broken glass. "Now tell me, Pat, what's that in the window?" "Why, it's an arm, Your Honor." "An arm, you goose? Who ever saw one that size?" "Why, it fills the whole window." "Well, yes, it does, Your Honor, but it's still an arm." "Well, it's got no business here. Go and take it away." There was a long silence after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then. "Sure, I don't like it, Your Honor. At all, at all. Do as I tell you, you coward." And at last, she spread her hand out again and made another snatch into the air. This time, there were 2 shrieks and more sounds of broken glass. "I wonder what they'll do next," thought Alice. "As for pulling me out of this window, I only wish they could. I'm sure I don't want to stay in here any longer either." She waited for some time without hearing anything more. At last came a rumbling of little cartwheels and the sound of a good many voices, all whispering together. "Where's the ladder? Why, I hadn't thought to bring one. Bill's got the other one. Bill, fetch us the ladder, lad. Here, put him up at this corner. No, tie them together first. They don't reach half high enough yet. Oh, they'll do well enough. Hey, stop being particular. Here, Bill, catch hold of this rope. Wait, mind that loose slate. Oh, it's coming down. Heads below." Alice listened intently, wondering what they were going to do next. She thought she heard someone up near the chimney. "Oh, it must be Bill coming down the chimney then," thought Alice to herself. Shy, they seem to put everything upon Bill. I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick it a little. She drew her foot as far down the chimney as she could, and waited until she heard a little animal, though she couldn't guess which kind, scratching and scrambling about in the chimney. She said to herself, "This must be Bill." She gave one sharp kick and waited to see what would happen next. The first thing she heard was a general chorus of, "Oh no, there goes Bill." And then she heard the rabbit's voice, "Catch him, you fools, he's over there." And then silence, and then a confusion of voices. "Hold up his head now, Brandy now. Don't choke him. How is it, old fellow? What happened to you? Tell us all about it." Last came a little feeble, squeaking voice. That must be Bill, thought Alice. Well, I hardly know. No more, thank you, I'm better now. But I'm a deal too flustered to tell you. All I know is, something comes at me like a jack-in-the-box, and up I goes like a skyrocket. So you did, old fellow, said the others. We must burn the house down, said the rabbit. And Alice called out as loudly as she could, If you do, I'll set Dinah on you. There was a dead silence instantly, and Alice thought to herself, I wonder what they will do next. If they had any sense, they'd take the roof off. After a minute or two, they began moving about again, and Alice heard the rabbit say, A barrel full will do to begin with. A barrel full of what? Thought Alice. But she had not long to doubt, for the next moment, a shower of little pebbles came rattling in at the window, and some of them hit her in the face. I'll put a stop to this, she said to herself, and she shouted out, You'd better not do that again. This produced another dead silence. Alice noticed, with some surprise, that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes as they lay upon the floor. A bright idea came into her head. If I eat one of these cakes, she thought, it's sure to make some sort of change in my size, and as it can't possibly make me larger, I bet it'll make me smaller. So she swallowed one of the cakes and was delighted to find that she began shrinking immediately. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door, she ran out of the house and found quite a crowd of little animals and birds waiting outside. The poor little lizard, named Bill, was in the middle, being held up by 2 guinea pigs who were giving him something out of a bottle. They all made a rush at Alice the moment she appeared, but she ran off as fast as she could and soon found herself safe in a thick wood. "The first thing I've got to do," said Alice to herself as she wandered about in the wood, "is to grow to my right size again. And the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan." It sounded like an excellent plan, no doubt, and very neatly and simply arranged. The only difficulty was that she had not the smallest idea of how to set about it, and while she was peering about anxiously among the trees, a little sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. An enormous puppy was looking down at her with large round eyes, and he feebly stretched out one paw, trying to touch her. "Oh, you poor little thing," said Alice in a coaxing tone, and she tried hard to whistle to it, but she was terribly frightened all the time at the thought that it might be hungry, in which case it would be very likely to eat her up in spite of all her coaxing. Hardly knowing what she did, she picked up a little stick and held it out to the puppy, whereupon the puppy jumped into the air off of all of his feet at once. He gave a little yelp of delight and rushed at the stick. Alice dodged behind a great thistle to keep herself from being run over, and the moment she appeared on the other side, the puppy made another rush at the stick, and he tumbled head over heels in his hurry to get a hold of it. Then Alice, thinking that it was very like having a game of play, expecting every moment to be trampled under its feet, ran around the thistle again, and then the puppy began a series of short charges at the stick, running a very little way forwards each time and a long way back. He barked hoarsely all the while, till at last he sat down a good way off, panting. His tongue hung out of his mouth, and his great round eyes began to close. This seemed to Alice a good opportunity for making her escape, so she set off at once and ran until she was quite tired and out of breath, and until the puppy's bark sounded quite faint in the distance. "And yet, what a dear little puppy that was," said Alice, as she leaned against a buttercup to rest herself. She fanned herself with one of the leaves. "I should have liked teaching tricks very much, if only I'd been the right size to do it. Oh dear, I'd nearly forgotten that I've got to grow up again. Let me see. How is it to be managed? I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other. But the great question is, what?" The great question certainly was. Alice looked all around her at the flowers and the blades of grass, but she did not see anything that looked like the right thing to eat or drink, given her circumstances. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as herself, and when she had looked under it, and on both sides of it, and behind it, it occurred to her that she might as well look and see what was on the top. She stretched herself up on her tiptoes and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met those of a large caterpillar who was sitting on the top with his arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah and taking not the smallest notice of her or of anything else around him. Chapter 5. Advice from a Caterpillar. The caterpillar and Alice looked at each other for some time in silence. At last the caterpillar took the hookah out of his mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Well then, who are you?" said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, "I hardly know, sir. Just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning. But I think I must have been changed several times since then." "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar. "Explain yourself already." "Well, I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir," said Alice, "because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," said the caterpillar. "I don't know how to put it more clearly," Alice replied, as politely as she could manage, "for I can't understand it myself to begin with. And being so many different sizes in one day is very confusing for me." "No, it isn't," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps you haven't found that out yet then," said Alice. "But when you have to turn into a chrysalis, and you will someday, you know, and then after that into a butterfly, I should think you'll feel quite strange then, won't you?" "Not a bit," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps your feelings might be different," said Alice. "All I know is it would feel very strange to me." "You," said the caterpillar. "Who are you?" This brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. Alice felt a little irritated at the caterpillars making such very short remarks, and she drew herself up and said, very gravely, "I think you ought to tell me who you are first." "Why?" asked the caterpillar. Here was another puzzling question, and as Alice could not think of any good reason, and as the caterpillar seemed to be in a very unpleasant state of mind, she turned away. "Hey now, get back here," said the caterpillar. "I have something important to say." This sounded promising. Certainly. So Alice turned and came back to him again. "Now you hold your temper," said the caterpillar. "Is that all?" asked Alice, swallowing down her anger as well as she could. "No," said the caterpillar. Alice thought she might as well wait, as she had nothing else to do, and perhaps, after all, it might tell her something worth hearing. For some minutes, the caterpillar puffed away without speaking, but at last it unfolded its arms, took the hookah out of its mouth again, and said, "So you think you're changed, do you?" "I'm afraid I am, sir," said Alice. "I can't remember the things I used, and I don't keep the same size for 10 minutes." "Can't remember what things?" asked the caterpillar. "Well," said Alice, "I've tried to say, 'How doth the busy bee?' but it all comes out different, Okay then, repeat. You are old, Father William, said the caterpillar. Alice folded her hands and began. You are old, Father William, the young man said, and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think, at your age, that is right? In my youth, Father William replied to his son, I feared it might injure the brain. But now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again. You are old, said the youth, as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that? In my youth, said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, I keep all of my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple. You are old, said the youth, and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it? In my youth, said his father, I took to the law and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life. You are old, said the youth. One would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever? I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough, said his father. Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs. The caterpillar interrupted Alice. That is not said right. I know, not quite right, I'm afraid, said Alice timidly. Some of the words have gotten altered. No, it is wrong from beginning to end, said the caterpillar. And there was silence for some minutes. The caterpillar was the first to speak. Well, tell me then, what size do you want to be? Oh, I'm not particular to a size, Alice hastily replied. Only one doesn't like changing so often, you know. I don't know, said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing. She had never been so much contradicted in her life before, and she felt she was losing her temper. Are you content now? Asked the caterpillar. Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind, said Alice. 3 inches is such a wretched height to be. No, it's a very good height indeed, said the caterpillar. He reared himself upright as he spoke. He was exactly 3 inches high. But I'm not used to this, pleaded poor Alice, and she thought to herself, I wish the creatures wouldn't be so easily offended. You'll get used to it in time, said the caterpillar, and he put the hookah into his mouth and began smoking again. This time, Alice waited patiently until he chose to speak on his own. In a minute or 2, the caterpillar took the hookah from his mouth and yawned once, and then gave himself a little shake. Then he got down off the mushroom and crawled away in the grass. He remarked as he went, one side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow smaller. One side of what? The other side of what? Alice thought to herself. Of the mushroom, silly, said the caterpillar, just as if she'd asked her question aloud. And in another moment, he had gone from her sight. Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom for a moment, trying to make out which were the two sides of it. And as it was perfectly round, she found this a very difficult question. However, at last she stretched her arms round it as far as they would go, and broke off a bit of the edge in each hand. Well, now which is which, she said to herself, and nibbled a little of the right-handed bit to try for effect. The next moment she felt a violent blow underneath her chin, for it had struck her foot. She was a good deal frightened by this very sudden change, but she felt that there was no time to be lost. She was shrinking so rapidly. So she set to work at once to eat some of the other side. Her chin was pressed so closely against her foot that there was hardly room to open her mouth. But she did at last, and managed to swallow a morsel of the left-hand bit. "Hey, my head's free at last," said Alice in a tone of delight, which changed into alarm in another moment, when she found that her shoulders were nowhere to be found. All she could see, when she looked down, was an immense length of neck, which seemed to rise like a stalk out of the sea of green leaves that lay far below her. "What can all this green stuff be?" asked Alice. "And where have my shoulders gone? And oh, my poor hands, how is it I can't see you?" She was moving them about as she spoke, but no result seemed to follow, except a little shaking among the distant green leaves. As there seemed to be no chance of getting her hands up to her head, she tried to get her head down to them, and was delighted to find that her neck would bend about easily in any direction, like a serpent. She had just succeeded in curving it down into a graceful zigzag, and was going to dive in among the leaves, which she found to be nothing but the tops of the trees under which she had been wandering. Suddenly, a sharp hiss made her draw back in a hurry. A large pigeon had flown into her face, and was beating her violently with its wings. "Get away, serpent!" screamed the pigeon. "I am not a serpent," said Alice indignantly. "Leave me alone." "Serpent, I say again," repeated the pigeon, but in a more subdued tone. And he added, with a kind of sob, "I've tried every way, and nothing seems to suit them." "I haven't the least idea of what you're talking about," said Alice. "I've tried the roots of trees, and I've tried the banks, and I've tried the hedges," the pigeon went on. "But those serpents, there's no pleasing them." Alice grew more and more puzzled, but she thought there was no use in saying anything more until the pigeon had finished. "As if it wasn't enough trouble hatching the eggs," said the pigeon, "but I must be on the lookout for serpents, night and day. Why, I haven't had a wink of sleep in 3 weeks. "I'm very sorry you've been annoyed," said Alice, who was beginning to see his meaning. "And just as I'd taken the highest tree in the wood," continued the pigeon, he raised his voice to a shriek, "and just as I was thinking I'd be free of them at last, they must needs come wriggling down from the sky. Get away, serpent." "But I'm not a serpent, I tell you," said Alice. "I am a—" "Well, what are you then?" said the pigeon. "I can see you're trying to invent something." "I'm a little girl," said Alice, rather doubtfully, as she remembered the number of changes she had gone through that day. "A likely story indeed," said the pigeon, in a tone of the deepest contempt. "I've seen a good many girls in my time, but never one with a neck like that. No, you're a serpent, and there's no denying it. I suppose you'll be telling me next that you've never tasted an egg." "Well, I have tasted eggs, certainly," said Alice. "But little girls eat eggs, more than serpents, I'm afraid." "I don't believe you," said the pigeon. "But if they do, why then they're a kind of serpent, and that's all I can say." This was such a new idea to Alice that she was quite silent for a moment. This gave the pigeon the opportunity to add, "You're looking for eggs, I know that well enough. And what does it matter to me whether you're a little girl or a serpent?" "It matters a good deal to me," said Alice. "But I'm not looking for eggs, as it happens. And if I was, I shouldn't want yours, because I don't like them raw." "Well, be off then," said the pigeon, as he settled down again into his nest. Alice crouched down among the trees as well she could, for her neck kept getting entangled among the branches, and every now and then she had to stop to untwist it. After a while, she remembered that she still held pieces of mushroom in her hands, and she set to work very carefully, nibbling first at one and then the other, and growing sometimes taller and sometimes shorter, until she had succeeded in bringing herself down to her somewhat normal height. It was so long since she had been anything near the right size that it felt quite strange to her at first, but she got used to it in a few moments. She began talking to herself, as usual. "Come on now, there's half my plan done. How puzzling all these changes are. I'm never sure what I'm going to be from one moment to another. However, I've got back to my right size, so the next thing is, how do I get into that beautiful garden? How is that to be done, I wonder?" As she said this, she came suddenly upon an open place with a little house in it, about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives here," thought Alice, "it'll never do to come upon them this size. Why, I don't want to frighten them out of their wits." So she began nibbling at the right-hand bit again, and did not venture to go near the house until she had brought herself down to 9 inches high. Chapter 6. Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two, Alice stood looking at the house and wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in livery came running out of the wood. She considered him a footman because he was in livery. Otherwise, judging by his face only, she would have called him a fish. He rapped loudly at the door with his knuckles. It was opened by another footman in livery, with a round face and large eyes like a frog. This one, Alice noticed, had powdered hair that curled all over his head. She felt very curious to know what this was all about, and crept a little way out of the wood to listen. The fish footman began by producing from under his arm a great letter nearly as large as himself, and he handed this over to the other, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman replied in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little, "From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." Then they both bowed low, and their heads bonked together. Alice laughed so much at this that she had to run back into the wood for fear of their overhearing her, and when she next peeped out, the fish footman was gone, and the other was sitting on the ground near near the door, staring stupidly up into the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door, and she knocked. "There's no sort of use in knocking," said the footman, "and that for two reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you, and secondly, because they're making such a noise inside, no one could possibly hear you." And certainly there was a most extraordinary noise going on within, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or kettle had been broken to pieces. "Please then, how am I to get in?" asked Alice. "There might be some sense in your knocking," the footman went on, "if we had the door between us. For instance, if you were inside, you might knock, and I could let you out, you know." He was looking up into the sky all the time he was speaking, and this Alice thought decidedly uncivil. "But perhaps he can't help it," she said to herself. "His eyes are so very nearly at the top of his head. But at any rate, he might answer questions. How am I to get in?" she asked again. "Well, I will sit here," the footman remarked, "until tomorrow." At this moment, the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out, straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose and broke to pieces against one of the trees behind him. "Or the next day, maybe," the footman continued, exactly as if nothing had happened. "I'm sorry," asked Alice again. "How am I to get in?" "Are you going to get in at all?" asked the footman. "That's the first question, you know." It was no doubt, only Alice did not like to be told so. "It's really dreadful," she muttered to herself, "the way all the creatures argue. It's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think this a good opportunity for repeating his remark, and he said, "I shall sit here, off and on, every day, every single day." "But what am I to do?" asked Alice. "Anything you like," said the footman. He began to whistle. "Oh, there's no use in talking to you," said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door herself and went inside. The door led her into a large kitchen which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron which seemed to be full of soup. "There's certainly too much pepper in that soup," said Alice to herself, as well as she could, for sneezing. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately, without a moment's pause. The only things in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and a large cat which was sitting on the hearth and grinning from ear to ear. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners to speak first. "Why does your cat grin like that?" "He is a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why. Pig." She said the last word with such sudden violence that Alice quite jumped, but she saw in another moment that it was addressed towards the baby and not to her, so she took courage from this and went on again. "I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin." Well, they all can, said the Duchess, and most of them do. I've never met any that do, said Alice, as politely as she could manage, though she did feel quite pleased to be in a conversation now. You don't know much, said the Duchess, and that's a fact. Alice did not like the tone of this remark, and though it would be as well to introduce some other subject of conversation, while she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire and at once set to work throwing everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. The fire irons came first, then followed a shower of saucepans, plates, and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them, even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already that it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Oh, please, what are you doing?" cried Alice. She jumped up and down in an agony of terror. "Oh, there goes his precious nose," as an unusually large saucepan flew close by and very nearly carried off his nose. "If everybody minded their own business," said the Duchess in a hoarse growl, "the world would go round a deal faster than it does." "Well, that would not be to anyone's advantage," said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity to show off a little knowledge. "Just think of what work it would make within the day and night. You see, the earth takes 24 hours to turn around on its axis." "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." Alice glanced rather anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take a hint, but the cook was busy stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening. So she went on again. 24 hours, I think. Or is it 12? "Oh, don't bother me," said the Duchess. "I could never abide figures." And with that she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line. "Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases." While the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the poor baby violently up and down, and the little baby howled so that Alice could barely hear the words. "I speak severely to my boy. I beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases." "Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like," the Duchess said to Alice. She flung her baby towards Alice. "I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen anyway." She hurried out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went on, but it just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was quite strangely shaped, and she held out its arms and legs in all directions. "This baby looks just like a starfish," she thought. The poor little thing was snorting like a steam engine, and it kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether, for the first minute or two, it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made out the proper way of nursing, which was to twist it up into a sort of knot, and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot, so as to prevent itself from undoing, she carried it out into the open air. "If I don't take this child away with me," said Alice, "they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave this child behind?" The little baby grunted in reply Now, said Alice, don't grunt. That's not at all a proper way of expressing yourself. The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter. There could be no doubt that it had a very turned-up nose, a nose much more like a snout than a real nose. Also, its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby, although Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. But perhaps it was only sobbing, she thought, and she looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No tears, she confirmed. If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear, said Alice seriously, I'll have nothing more to do with you, so don't do that. The poor little thing sobbed again, or grunted. It was impossible to say which, and they went on for some while in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, now what am I to do with this creature when I get home? When it grunted again, so violently that she looked down into its face with some alarm. This time there could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig, and she felt that it would be quite absurd of her to carry it any further. So she set the little creature down and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the woods. If it had grown up, she said to herself, it would have made a dreadfully ugly child, but it makes a rather handsome pig, I think. And she began thinking over other ugly children she knew, who might do very well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, if only one knew the right way to change them, when she was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting off on a bough of a tree. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, it had very long claws and a great many teeth, so she felt it ought to be treated with respect. Cheshire Puss, she began, rather timidly, as she did not know at all whether it would like this name. However, it only grinned wider. Come, it's pleased so far, thought Alice, and she went on. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? The cat replied, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. I don't really care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't really matter which way you choose, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, said Alice. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. What sort of people live around here? In that direction, said the cat, pointing to the right with its paw, lives a hatter, and in that direction, he said, waving his paw to the left, lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad. But I don't want to go among mad people, said Alice. Oh, you can't really help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. We're quite clearly all mad here. Now, how do you know that I'm mad? Asked Alice. You must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Am I right? Alice didn't think that proved anything at all. However, she went on. And how do you know that you're mad? To begin with, said the cat, a dog's not mad. You'll grant me that. I suppose so, said Alice. Well then, the cat went on. You see, a dog growls when it's angry and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now I growl when I'm pleased, and I wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore, I am mad. Now I call it purring, not growling, said Alice. Fine, call it whatever you like, said the cat. Did you play croquet with the Queen today? I would like it very much, said Alice, but I haven't been invited. You'll see me there, said the cat, and he vanished. Alice was not very much surprised at this. She was getting used to strange things happening. While she was looking at the place where the cat had been, it suddenly reappeared. By the by, said the cat, what happened to the baby? I'd nearly forgotten to ask. The baby turned into a pig, said Alice quietly, just as if it had come back in a natural way. I thought it would, said the cat, and he vanished again. Alice waited a little, half expecting the cat to return, but it did not appear. After a minute or two, she walked on in the direction in which the March Hare was said to live. I've seen hatters before, she said to herself. The March Hare will be much more interesting. And perhaps, as this is May and not March, perhaps he won't yet be raving mad. At least not so mad as he would be in March. As she said this, she looked up, and there was the cat again, sitting on a branch of a tree. Hey now, said the cat, did you say pig or fig? I said pig, replied Alice, and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You're making me quite scared. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished, very slowly, beginning with the end of his tail and ending with his grin, which remained for some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, said Alice, I've often seen a cat without a grin, but a grin without a cat, that's the most curious thing I've ever seen in my life. She had not gone much further before she came in sight of the house of the March Hare. She thought it must be the right house, because the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. It was so large a house that she did not like to go near until she had nibbled some of the left-handed bit of mushroom. This raised her to about 2 feet high, although even then she walked up towards it rather timidly, saying to herself, I suppose it should be raving mad after all. I almost wish I'd gone to see the Hatter instead. Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having a tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and taking over its head. Very uncomfortable for a dormouse, thought Alice. Only, as it's asleep, I guess it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. No room, they cried out when they saw Alice coming. But there's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. Well then, have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she said. That's because there isn't any, said the March Hare. Well then, it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. "It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited," said the March Hare. "Hey, I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's laid out for a great many more than 3 people." "Your hair wants cutting," said the Hatter. He'd been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was the first time he had spoken. "You should learn not to make personal remarks," said Alice with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide upon hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" "Come, we shall have some fun now," thought Alice. "I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that," she said aloud. "Tell me then, do you mean you think you can find the answer to it?" asked the March Hare. "Exactly so," said Alice. "Then go ahead, say what you mean," the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. "At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "No, it's not the same thing at all," said the Hatter. "You might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see." "Or," added the March Hare, "you might as well say I like what I get is the same as I get what I like." "And you might as well say," added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep now, "that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe." "It is the same thing with you," said the Hatter. And here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a moment. Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks. Although it wasn't much, the Hatter was the first to break the silence. "Tell me, what day of the month is it?" He turned to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then. He held it to his ear. Alice considered this a bit and then said, "It is the 4th. 2 days wrong," sighed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't suit the works." He looked angrily at the March Hare. "Hey, it was the best butter," the March Hare meekly replied. "Yes, but some crumbs must have gone in as well," the Hatter grumbled. "You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark. "It was the best butter, you know." Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is." "Well, why should it?" muttered the Hatter. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?" "Of course not," Alice replied very readily. "But that's because it stays the same year for a long time together." "Which is just the case with mine," said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. "I don't quite understand you," she said, as politely as she could manage. "Hey, the Dormouse is asleep again," said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said, without opening his eyes, "Of course, of course. Just what I was going to remark myself." "Well now," the Hatter said, turning to Alice again, "have you guessed the riddle yet?" "No, I give up," replied Alice. "Tell me what's the answer." "I haven't the slightest idea," said the Hatter. "Nor I," said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might do something better with the time," she said, "than waste it in asking riddles that have no answers." "If you knew time as well as I do," said the Hatter,
You wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him. I don't know what you mean, said Alice. Of course you don't, the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. I dare say you never even spoke to Time. Perhaps not, Alice replied cautiously, but I know I have to beat Time when I learn music. Ah, that accounts for it then, said the Hatter. He won't stand a beating. Now if you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to Time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner. I only wish it was, the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. That would be grand, certainly, said Alice thoughtfully. But then, I shouldn't be hungry for it yet, you know. Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter. But you could keep it to 1:30 as long as you liked. Is that the way you manage? Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. Not I, he replied. We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know, pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing. Are you ready? Alice sighed. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at. You know the song, perhaps? I guess I've heard something like it, said Alice. It goes on, you know, the Hatter continued, in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle. Here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in his sleep. Twinkle, 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 twinkle. And went on so long they had to pinch him to make him stop. Well, I've hardly finished the verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen jumped up and bawled out, He's murdering the time. Off with his head. Well, how dreadfully savage, exclaimed Alice. And ever since that, the Hatter went on, he won't do a thing I ask. And now, it's always 6 o'clock. A bright idea came into Alice's head just then. Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here? She asked. Yes, that's it, said the Hatter. It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles. Then you keep moving around, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up. But what happens when you come to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted. He yawned. I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story. I'm afraid I don't know one, said Alice. She began to feel rather alarmed at the proposal. Well then, the Dormouse shall, they both cried. Wake up, Dormouse. And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. I wasn't asleep, he said, in a hoarse, feeble voice. I heard every word you fellows were saying. Tell us a story, then, said the March Hare. Yes, please do, said Alice. And be quick about it, added the Hatter, or you'll be asleep again before it's done. Okay, then, the Dormouse began. Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters. Their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly. They lived at the bottom of a well. Well, hang on, said Alice. What did they live on? She always took great interest in questions of eating and drinking. They lived on a tart, said the Dormouse, after thinking for a moment or two. Well, they couldn't have done that, you know, Alice gently remarked. They'd have been ill. So they were, said the Dormouse. very ill. Alice tried to fancy to herself what an extraordinary ways of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on. But why did they live at the bottom of a well? Take some more tea, dear, the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. I've had nothing yet, Alice replied in an offended tone, so I can't take more. You mean you can't take less, said the Hatter. It's very easy to take more than nothing. Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice. Well, who's making personal remarks now? Said the Hatter triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and some bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. Tell me, why did they live at the bottom of a well? The Dormouse took a moment to think about it and said, It was a tart well. There is no such thing, Alice said sassily. The Hatter and the March Hare went, shh, shh, and the Dormouse sulkily remarked, If you can't be civil, you'd better finish the story yourself. No, I'm sorry, go on, Alice said very humbly. I won't interrupt again. I dare say there may be one. One indeed, said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on, and so these three little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know. What did they draw? Asked Alice, quite forgetting her promise. Tarts, said the Dormouse, without considering it at all this time. I want a clean cup, interrupted the Hatter. Let's all move one place over. He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change. Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. But I don't understand. Where did they draw the tarts from? You can draw water out of a water well, said the Hatter, so I think you could draw tarts out of a tarts well, right? But they were in the well, said Alice to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice the Hatter this time. Well, of course they were, said the Dormouse. Well in. This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting him. They were learning to draw, the Dormouse went on. He yawned and rubbed his eyes, for he was getting very sleepy. And they drew all manner of things. Everything that begins with an M. Why an M? Said Alice. Why not? Said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed his eyes by this time, and was going off into a doze, but, on being pinched by the Hatter, he woke up again with a little shriek, and went on. That begins with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and munchness. You know you say things are much of munchness. Did you ever see a thing such as a drawing of a muchness? Really, now you ask me, said Alice, very much confused. I don't think. Then you shouldn't talk, said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. At any rate, I'll never go there again, said Alice, as she picked her way through the wood. That was the stupidest tea party I've ever been to in all of my life. Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. Well, that's very curious, she thought. But everything's so curious today. I think I may as well go in at once. and so she went inside. Once more, she found herself in a long hall and close to a little glass table. Well, now I'll manage better this time, she said to herself. She began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket until now. She ate at the mushroom until she was about a foot high, and then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden among the bright flower beds and the beautiful fountains. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, of course, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, number 5. Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said number 5 in a sulky tone. "Number 7 jogged my elbow." After this, number 7 looked up and said, "That's right, number 5. Always lay the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said number 5. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday that you deserved to be beheaded." "Well, what for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, number 2, said number 7. "Yes, it is his business," said number 5, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." Number 7 flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them. He checked himself suddenly. The others looked around also, and then all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why you are painting those roses red?" Numbers 5 and 7 said nothing, but they looked at number 2. Number 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best before she comes and she sees." At this moment, number 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked around again, eager to see this Queen. First came 10 soldiers, carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next came the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. He was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went on without noticing her. Then he followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And at last, of all this grand possession, came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought to lie down on her face like the three gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at other processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people had to lie upon their faces so that they couldn't even see it? So she stood still where she was, and she waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "You are an idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently. And, turning to Alice, she went on, "Well then, what's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," Alice said very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the three gardeners. They were lying around the rose tree that they had been painting, for you see, as they were lying on their faces, and the patterns on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack of cards, she could not tell whether they were gardeners, soldiers, courtiers, or three of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and, after glaring at Alice for a moment like a wild beast, she screamed, "Off with her head! Off with her head!" "Nonsense," said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and this turned the Queen silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, this is only a child." The Queen turned angrily from him and said to the Knave, "Turn them over now." The Knave did so very carefully with one foot. "Get up now," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice. The three gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Stop that at once," screamed the Queen. "You're making me crazy." And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "Tell me at once, what is this madness you're doing?" "Well, may it please your Majesty," said number 2, in a very humble tone. He got down on one knee as he spoke. We were just trying." "I see what you were trying," said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads," she shouted. And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners. They ran to Alice for protection. "No, this isn't happening. You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered for about a minute or 2, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads gone?" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone, if it please your Majesty," the soldiers said in reply. "Well, that's right," shouted the Queen. "So tell me, can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Of course I can," shouted Alice. "Come on then," roared the Queen. And Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. "It's a very, very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess? Isn't she coming?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit, in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "I'm afraid the Duchess is under sentence of execution." What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'what a pity'?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'what for?'" "She boxed the Queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Now you hush," said the rabbit in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you, you see. She came rather late, and the Queen said—" "Get to your places," shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against one another. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in all her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs, the mallets live flamingos, and the card soldiers had to fold themselves in half and stand on each other's hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm. Its legs hung down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with the flamingo's head, it would twist itself round and look her up in the face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help burst out laughing. And when she had got its head rightly down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog, and as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs. In a very short time, the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head! Off with his head!" about once each minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy, to be sure. She had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew it could happen at any moment. And then she thought, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it for a moment, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have someone to talk to." "Well, how are you getting on now?" said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for him to speak with. Alice waited until the eyes appeared, and then nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, until its ears have come, or at least one of them. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice set down her flamingo and began an account of the game. She felt very glad there was someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more appeared. It was just ears, a nose, a mouth, and a tail. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began, in a rather complaining tone. "And they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak. And they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it is for all of these things to be alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about the other end of the ground. He's a card, an actual playing card. And I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the Queen?" asked the cat. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Just then, she noticed that the Queen was close behind her, listening. So she went on. "Extremely likely to win, that it's hardly worth finishing the game." The Queen smiled and passed along. "Who are you talking to?" said the King, coming up alongside Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "This is a friend of mine, the Cheshire Cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce you to him." "I don't like the look of him at all," said the King. "However, he may kiss my hand if he likes." "I'd rather not," the Cheshire Cat remarked. "Don't be silly," said the King, "and don't you look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he was speaking. "A cat may surely look at a king," said Alice. "I know I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed, the book and all," said the King very decidedly, and he called the Queen, who was passing by them at that moment. "My dear, I think we should have this cat removed as well." The Queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the King eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on. She heard the Queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them against the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden. Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over, and both the hedgehogs were out of sight. "I guess it doesn't matter much," thought Alice, "as all of the cards are no longer arches and are gone from this side of the ground." So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back for a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the King, and the Queen, and all were talking at once, while all the rest of the cards were quite silent, though they looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all three to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her, though, as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard indeed to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it from, and he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at this time in his life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could indeed be beheaded, and that you weren't allowed to talk such nonsense. The queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all around. And it was this last remark that had made the whole party look grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say, but the cat belongs to the Duchess. You have to ask the Duchess before you can execute him. While she's in prison, the queen said to the executioner, "Fetch her to me now." And the executioner ran off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the Duchess, the cat had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle's Story. "You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing," said the Duchess, as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that made her so savage when they had first met in the kitchen. "When I'm the Duchess," she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone though, "I won't have any pepper in the kitchen at all. Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people hot-tempered," she went on, very much pleased at having found out a new kind of rule, "and vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and barley sugar and such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish that people knew that. Then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know." She had quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. "You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit." "Perhaps it hasn't one," Alice ventured to remark. "Tut, tut, child," said the Duchess. "Everything has a moral, if only you can find it." And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like keeping so close to her, first, because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly, because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin upon Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she did not like to be rude, so she bore it as well as she could. "The game's going on rather better now," she said, by way of keeping up the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love. 'Tis love that makes the world go round." "Somebody said," Alice whispered, "that it's done by everybody minding their own business." "Ah, well, I think that means much the same thing," said the Duchess. She dug her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder, and she added, "And the moral of that is, take care of the scents, and the sounds will take care of themselves." How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice thought to herself. "I dare say you're wondering why I don't put my arm around your waist," the Duchess said after a pause. "The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try an experiment? He might bite, Alice cautiously replied, not feeling at all anxious to have the experiment tried. Very true, said the Duchess. Flamingos and mustard both bite. And the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together. Except mustard isn't a bird, Alice remarked. Ah, yes, right as usual, said the Duchess. What a clear way you have of putting things. It's a mineral, I think, said Alice. Of course it is, said the Duchess. She seemed ready to agree to everything that Alice said. There's actually a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours. Oh, I know, exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. Mustard is a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is. I quite agree with you, said the Duchess, and the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be. Or, if you'd like it put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others, that what you were, or what might have been, was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared them to be otherwise. I don't think that makes sense, said Alice, very politely. If I had it written down, maybe, but I can't quite follow it as you say it. Ah, well, that's nothing to what I could say if I chose, the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. Pray, don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that, said Alice. Oh, don't talk about trouble, said the Duchess. I'll make you a present of everything I've said, as yet. What a cheap sort of present, thought Alice. I'm glad they don't give birthday presents like that. But she did not venture to say this out loud. Thinking again, the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. I've a right to think, said Alice sharply. She was beginning to feel a bit worried. Just about as much right, said the Duchess, as the pigs have to fly. And the more... But here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her favorite word, moral, and the arm that was linked to hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. A fine day, Your Majesty, the Duchess began, in a low, weak voice. Now I give you fair warning, said the Queen. She stamped her foot on the ground as she spoke. Either you or your head must be off, and that in about half no time. Make your choice. The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment. Let's get on with the game then, the Queen said to Alice. And Alice was too much frightened to say anything else, but slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game. The Queen merely remarked that a moment's delay would cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off quarreling with the other players, and she kept shouting, "Off with his head! Off with her head!" Those whom she sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being archers to do this, so that by the end of half an hour there were no archers left, and all of the players, except for the King, the Queen, and Alice, were in custody and under sentence of execution. Then the Queen left off, quite out of breath, and said to Alice, "Have you seen the mock turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's the thing mock turtle soup is made from," said the Queen. "I never saw one, or heard of one," said Alice. "Well, come on then," said the Queen, "and he shall tell you his history." As they walked off together, Alice heard the king say in a low voice to the company in general, "You are all pardoned. Come on now, that's a good thing." Alice sighed in relief at this, thinking, what a good thing, for she had felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the queen had ordered. They very soon came upon a griffin, lying fast asleep in the sun. "Up, lazy thing," said the queen, "and take this young lady to see the Mock Turtle and to hear his history. I must go back and see after some executions that I ordered." And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole, she figured the griffin was far safer than that savage queen, so she waited. The griffin sat up and rubbed its eyes, and then it watched the queen until she was out of sight, until it chuckled, "Oh, what fun she is!" "Well, what is the fun?" said Alice. "Why, she," said the griffin. "It's all her fancy, that. They never execute anybody, you know. Come on now." Everybody says "come on" here, thought Alice, although she followed slowly after it. I've never been so ordered around in all of my life. Never. They had not gone far before they saw the Mock Turtle in the distance, sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock, and as they came nearer, Alice could hear him sighing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "Tell me, what is his sorrow?" she asked the griffin, and the griffin answered, very nearly in the same words as before, "It's all his fancy, that. He hasn't got sorrow. Come on now." So they went up to the Mock Turtle, who looked at them with large eyes full of tears, but said nothing. "This here young lady," said the griffin. "She wants to know your history. Please tell her." "I'll tell it to her," said the Mock Turtle, in a deep, hollow tone. "Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word until I've finished." So they sat down, and nobody spoke for some time. Alice thought to herself, I don't see how he can ever finish if he never even begins. But she waited patiently. "Once," said the Mock Turtle at last, he gave a great sigh. "I was a real turtle." These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by an occasional exclamation from the griffin and the constant heavy sobbing of the Mock Turtle. Alice was very nearly ready to give up and say, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story," but she could not help thinking there must be something more to come, and she had nothing else to do really, so she sat still and said nothing. "When we were little," the Mock Turtle went on at last, more calmly, although he still sobbed a little now and then. "We went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise." "Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?" Alice asked. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," said the Mock Turtle. "Although, girl, you really are very dull. You ought to be ashamed of yourself for asking such a stupid question," added the griffin. And then they both sat in silence and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth in shame. At last the griffin said to the Mock Turtle, "Come along, old fellow. We don't have all day for your story." And the turtle went on in these words. "Yes, we went to school in the sea, although you might not believe it." "I never said I didn't," interrupted Alice. "You did," said the Mock Turtle. "Now hold your tongue, girl," added the griffin before Alice could speak again. The Mock Turtle went on. "We had the best of education. In fact, we went to school every day." "I've been to school too," said Alice. You needn't be so proud as all of that. With extras? Added the Mock Turtle. Yes, said Alice. We learned French and music and literature and history. And washing? Said the Mock Turtle. Certainly not, said Alice indignantly. Ah, then yours wasn't really a good school after all, said the Mock Turtle. His tone was one of great relief. Now at ours, they had at the end of the bill French, music, history, and washing, all extra. You couldn't have wanted it much, said Alice, living at the bottom of the sea. Actually, I couldn't afford to learn it, said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. I only took the regular course. And what was that? Inquired Alice. Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with, the Mock Turtle replied, and then the different branches of arithmetic, ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. I've never heard of uglification, Alice ventured to say. Is that something about being ugly? The Gryphon lifted both its paws in surprise. What? You've never heard of uglifying? It explained. You know what to beautify is, I suppose. Yes, said Alice doubtfully. It means to make something pretty. Well then, if you don't know what to uglify is, you are a simpleton. But I just asked if it meant to be ugly, Alice said. Although neither the turtle nor the Gryphon seemed to hear her. Alice did not feel encouraged to ask any more questions, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said, What else had you to learn? Well, there was mystery, the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects with his flappers. Mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography, then drawling. The drawling master was an old conger eel who used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils. What was that like? Said Alice. Well, I can't show it to you myself, the Mock Turtle said. I'm too stiff right now, and the Gryphon has never learned this. I hadn't the time, said the Gryphon. I went to the classics master, though. He was an old crab, actually. Oh, I never went to him, the Mock Turtle said. But I believe he also taught laughing and grief. I think I heard that once. Yes, he did, actually, said the Gryphon. He sighed to himself, and both creatures hid their faces in their paws. And tell me, how many hours a day did you do your lessons? Said Alice. She was in a hurry to change the subject, or end this conversation. 10 hours the first day, said the Mock Turtle, 9 the next, and so on. What a curious plan, exclaimed Alice. That's the reason they're called lessons, the Gryphon remarked, because they lesson from day to day. This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. Did that make the 11th day a holiday? Of course it was, said the Mock Turtle. And how did you manage on the 12th? Alice went on eagerly. I think that's enough about lessons, the Gryphon interrupted in a very decided tone. Tell her something about the games now. Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a moment sobs choked his voice. He does the same thing when he has bones in his throat, said the Gryphon, and he set to work to shake the turtle by punching him in the back. At last, the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again. You may not have lived much under the sea. I haven't, said Alice. And perhaps you were never even introduced to lobsters before. Alice began to say, I once tasted, but checked herself hastily and said, No, never. So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is. No, indeed, said Alice. What sort of a dance is it? I'll tell you, said the Gryphon. You first form into a line along the seashore. No, it's 2 lines, cried the Mock Turtle. Seals, turtles, salmon, and so on. And then, once you've cleared all of the jellyfish out of the way. Now, that does generally take some time, interrupted the Gryphon. You advance twice, said the Turtle. Each with a lobster as a partner, cried the Gryphon. Of course, the Mock Turtle said. Advance twice, get your partner, change lobsters, and retire in the same order. Then, said the Mock Turtle, you throw the lobsters as far out to sea as you can, and you swim after them, added the Gryphon. And then you turn a somersault in the sea, said the Turtle. He capered wildly about. Change lobsters again, added the Gryphon. Back to land again, and that's all the first figure, said the Mock Turtle. His voice dropped suddenly, and the 2 creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all of this time, sat down again very sadly and quietly and looked at Alice. She felt compelled to respond, so she added timidly, It sounds like a very pretty dance. Well, would you like to see it then? Said the Mock Turtle. Of course I would, said Alice. Come on then. Let's try the first figure, said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon. We can do it without lobsters today, said the Mock Turtle. But who should sing? Oh, you should definitely sing, said the Gryphon. I can never remember all of the words. So they began solemnly dancing round and round. Every now and again, they would tread on Alice's toes when they passed too closely to her, and they waved their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly. Will you walk a little faster? Said the Whiting to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle wheel. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you? Will you, won't you? Will you join me in a dance? Will you, won't you? Will you, won't you? Will you join me in this dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with the lobsters out to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave us a look askance. Said he thanked the Whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join me in this dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not join me in this dance. What matters it how far we go? His scaly friend replied. There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer it is to France. Alice sat for a moment, shocked by the words. "Thank you," she said. "That is a very interesting dance to watch." Although she felt very glad that it was over at last. "And I do so like that curious song about the whiting." "Oh," said the Mock Turtle, "about the whiting. You've seen them, of course." "Yes," said Alice. "I've often seen them at dinner." She checked herself hastily. "How very strange that you've seen them at dinner," said the Mock Turtle. "But if you've seen them so often, of course you know what they're like." "I believe so," Alice replied thoughtfully. "They often have their tails in their mouths, and they're all over crumbs." "I don't think that's right," said the Mock Turtle. "You're wrong about the crumbs. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea. But they do have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is..." For a moment, the Mock Turtle yawned and closed his eyes. "I don't know. Tell her the reason," he said to the Griffin. "The reason is," said the Griffin, "that they would go with the lobsters to their dance. So they got thrown out to sea. So they had to fall a long way. So they got their tails fast in their mouths, and they wouldn't take them out again. And that is why." "Thank you," said Alice. "That is very interesting. I never knew so much about whiting before." "Well, I can tell you more, if you like," said the Griffin. "Do you know why they are called whitings?" "I don't," said Alice. "Why don't you tell me?" "They do the boots and the shoes," said the Griffin very solemnly. Alice was thoroughly puzzled. "They do the boots and the shoes," she repeated. "Why, what are your shoes done with?" said the Griffin. "I mean, what makes them so shiny?" Alice looked down at her shoes and considered a little while before she gave her answer. "I think they're done with a black ink of some kind. Boots and shoes under the sea," the Griffin went on, "are done with whiting. And now you know." "But what are they made of?" Alice asked, her curiosity piqued. "Soles and eels, of course," the Griffin replied. "Even a shrimp could tell you that." "If I'd been the whiting," said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, "I'd have said to the porpoise, 'Keep back, please. We don't want you with us.'" "Well, they were obliged to have him with them," said the Mock Turtle. "No wise fish would go anywhere without a porpoise." "Wouldn't it really?" said Alice, in a tone of great surprise. "Of course not," said the Mock Turtle. "Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going on a journey, I should say, 'With what porpoise?'" "Don't you mean purpose?" said Alice, with a bit of sass. "I mean what I say," the Mock Turtle replied. His tone was slightly offended, and the Griffin added, "Come on now, let's hear some of your adventures." "I could tell you my adventures, beginning from this morning," said Alice. She felt a little timid about this, though. "But it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a completely different person then." "Well, now you have to explain," said the Turtle. No, the adventures first," said the Griffin. His tone was slightly impatient. Explanations can take a dreadful amount of time. So Alice began telling them her adventures, from the time when she first saw the white rabbit. She was a little nervous about it just at first. The two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide. But she gained courage as she told them her story. They remained perfectly quiet until she got to the part about her repeating, "You are old, Father William," to the caterpillar, and the words all coming different. And then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said, "That is very curious." "It's all about as curious as it can be," said the Griffin. "It all came different than I expected," the Turtle said thoughtfully. "I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her something." He looked at the Griffin as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice. "All right then. Stand up and repeat for us." "'Tis the voice of the sluggard," said the Griffin. "How the creatures order one about here, and they so often make me repeat lessons," thought Alice. "I might as well be at school for this." However, she got up and began to repeat the lesson, but her head was still full of the lobster quadrille, and she hardly knew what she was saying. And the words sounded very strange to her indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You have baked me too brown. I must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is happy as a lark and will talk in contemptuous tones of a shark. But when the tide rises, the sharks are all around." The Griffin stopped her. "That's different from what I used to say when I was a child," he said. "Well, I've never heard it before," said the Mock Turtle, "but it sounds like uncommon nonsense." Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way again. "I should like to have this explained to me," said the Turtle. "No, she can't explain it," said the Griffin hastily. "Just go on with the next verse," he said to her. "Well now, what about his toes?" the Mock Turtle persisted. "How could he turn them out with his nose, you know?" "It's actually the first position in dancing," Alice said. But she was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing, and she did so long to change the subject. "Now go on with the next verse, Alice," the Griffin repeated impatiently. "It begins with, 'I passed by his garden.'" Alice did not dare to disobey, although she felt sure it would all come wrong. But she went on in a trembling voice. "I passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took the pie crust and the gravy and the meat, while the owl had the dish and its share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, The owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl. He concluded his banquet. Hey now, what is the use of repeating all of this stuff? The Mock Turtle interrupted. If you don't explain it to me as you go on, you are by far the most confusing girl I have ever met. Yes, I think you'd better leave off, said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille? The Gryphon went on. Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song? Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind, Alice replied. She was so eager that the Gryphon said, in a rather offended tone, Humph, no accounting for taste. Sing her turtle soup, will you, old fellow? The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, in a sometimes choked voice, to sing. Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in hot tureen, who for dainties could not stoop. Soup of the evening, what a beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, what a beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. It's a beautiful soup. Soup of the evening. What a beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for two? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. It's a beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Soup of the evening. It's a beautiful soup. Hey, why don't you do the chorus again? Cried the Gryphon. And the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it when they heard a cry far off in the distance of the trial's beginning. Oh, perfect, cried the Gryphon. And, taking Alice by the hand, he hurried off, leaving the Mock Turtle all alone and without an end to his song. Tell me now, Alice panted as she ran alongside the Gryphon. What trial is it? No, come on, faster. And the Gryphon ran faster, grasping her hand as he went, while more and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words, Soup of the evening, it's a beautiful soup. Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king stood the White Rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good, thought Alice. It made her quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get this trial done already, she thought, and hand us round the refreshments. but there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find she knew the name of nearly everything there. "That's the judge," she said to herself. "I know this because of his great white wig." The judge, by the way, was actually the King of Hearts, and as he wore his crown over the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not very becoming, thought Alice. She looked around her and noticed what she thought to be the jury box. There were 12 creatures inside, and she was obliged to think creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some others were birds. "I suppose they are all the jurors." She said this last word 2 or 3 times to herself. "They're jurors, jurors, jurors." She was rather proud of this, for she thought, and rightly so, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well, she thought. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. "What are they doing?" whispered Alice to the Gryphon. "They can't have anything to put down yet before the trial's begun." "They're writing down their names," the Gryphon whispered in reply, "for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Well, what stupid things they are, then," Alice said in a loud, indignant voice. But she stopped hastily, for the White Rabbit cried out, "Silence in the court!" And the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously around to look at who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell the word stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. "A nice muddle their slates will be in before the trial's over," thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked on the paper. This, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, his name was Bill, and he was a lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it. So, after hunting all about, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day. And this was really of very little use, for his finger left no mark on the slate. "Herald," the king shouted, "read us the accusation." On this, the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on his trumpet, and then he unrolled his parchment scroll and read as follows. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and he took them quite away." "Consider your verdict now," the king said to the jury. "Not yet, not yet," the rabbit hastily interrupted. There's a great deal to come before that. Okay then, call your first witness, said the king. And the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on his trumpet, and he called out, "First witness!" The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "I beg your pardon, your Majesty," he began. "I beg your pardon for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "Well, you ought to have finished," said the king. "When on earth did you begin?" The Hatter looked over at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. 14th of March, I think it was, he said. "No, it was the 15th, said the March Hare. "No, it was the 16th, said the Dormouse. "Write that down," the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. "Take off your hat," the king said to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "It's a stolen hat?" the king exclaimed. He turned to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. "I have them to sell," the Hatter added as an explanation. "I've actually no hats of my own. I'm a Hatter." Here, the queen put on her spectacles and began staring at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. "Give your evidence then," said the king, "and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other. He looked uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of taking a bite of his bread and butter. Just at this moment, Alice felt a very curious sensation. This puzzled her a good deal until she could make out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court. But on second thought, she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her. "I wish you wouldn't squeeze so," said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," Alice said, very meekly. "I'm growing. It's not my fault, though." "Well, you've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," said Alice more boldly. "You know you're growing, too." "Yes," said the Dormouse, "but I grow at a reasonable pace, not in that ridiculous fashion of yours." And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time, the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers, "Bring me the list of the singers in that last concert," on which the wretched Hatter trembled so. He shook both of his shoes off in his fear. "Give your evidence now," the king repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not." "I'm just a poor man, your Majesty," the Hatter began. His voice trembled. "And I hadn't begun my tea. Not a week or so ago. And what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and then the twinkling of the tea. The twinkling of what? Asked the king. It began with the tea, the hatter replied. Of course, twinkling begins with a T, the king replied sharply. Do you take me for a fool? Go on with your story now. The hatter went on slowly. I'm a poor man, as I said, and most things twinkled after that, except the March Hare said, No, I didn't. The March Hare interrupted in a great hurry. You did so, said the hatter. I'll deny it, said the March Hare. He denies it, said the king. Leave out that part. Go on with your story, hatter. Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said, the hatter went on. He looked anxiously around to see if he could deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, as he was already fast asleep. After that, continued the hatter, I cut some more bread and butter. But what did the Dormouse say? One of the jury members asked. Now I can't remember, said the hatter. You must remember, said the king, or I'll have you executed. The miserable hatter dropped his teacup and dropped his bread and butter, and he got down on one knee. I'm a very poor man, Your Majesty, he said. I disagree, said the king. You're a very poor speaker. Here, one of the guinea pigs cheered and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. Alice was surprised at the use of the word suppressed in her mind, and as it is a rather hard word, she thought to herself how they had done it. The officers had a large canvas bag, which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this, they slipped the guinea pig head first, and then sat upon him. I'm glad I've seen that done, thought Alice to herself. I've so often read in the newspapers, at the ends of trials, there was some attempts at applause, which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. And as I saw it in the newspapers, I never understood what it meant until now. If that's all you know about it, you may stand down, said the king to the hatter. I can't go any lower, said the hatter. I'm already on the floor as it is. I meant you may sit down, the king replied. Here, another guinea pig cheered, and was also suppressed and sat upon. Come now, that finished the guinea pigs, thought Alice. I guess now we'll get on better with this trial. Actually, Your Majesty, I'd rather finish my tea, said the hatter. He looked over at the queen anxiously, and she appeared to be reading the list of singers. You may go, said the king, and the hatter hurriedly left the court. He didn't even put his shoes on. And just take his head off outside then, the queen added to one of the officers. But the hatter was out of sight before the officer could get out the door. Call the next witness, said the king. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was even before she got into the court, by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once. Give your evidence now, said the king. I cannot, said the cook. The king looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness. Well, if I must, I must, the king said. He looked about with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook until his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice, "Tell me, what are tarts made from?" "Pepper mostly," said the cook. "And also treacle," said a sleepy voice behind her. "Collar that dormouse," the king said. "Actually behead that dormouse. Turn that dormouse out of my court. Suppress him, pinch him, pull off his whiskers." For some minutes, the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. "Never mind," said the king, with an air of great relief. "Call the next witness." And he added in an undertone to the queen, "Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. This is making my forehead ache." Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like, for they hadn't gotten any evidence yet, she thought to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his voice, "Alice, it's your turn." Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence. "Here," cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown over the last few minutes. And she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all of the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below, where they lay sprawling about. This reminded her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I do beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay. She began picking them up as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All of them," he repeated with great emphasis. He looked directly at Alice as he said so. Alice looked down at the jury box and saw that, in her haste, she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail all about in a melancholy way, and he was quite unable to move on his own. She soon got the lizard out again and put him in right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in a trial one way up as another." As soon as the jury had recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with his mouth open, and he gazed into the roof of the court with wide eyes and open mouth. "Tell me, what do you know about this business?" the king asked Alice. "I don't know anything," said Alice. Nothing whatever? Persisted the king. Nothing whatever, said Alice. That's very important, the king said. He turned to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the rabbit interrupted. Unimportant, your majesty, means, of course. He said this very respectfully, but he frowned, and he made some faces unintentionally. Unimportant, of course, I meant, the king hastily said, and he went on to himself in an undertone. Important, unimportant, unimportant, important. He tried to decide which word sounded best. At least, that's what it looked like to Alice. Some of the jury wrote down important, and some wrote down unimportant. Alice could see this, as she was near enough to look over at their slates. But it doesn't matter one bit, she thought to herself. At this moment, the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his own notebook, cackled out, "Silence!" And he read from his book, Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high must leave the court. Everyone's eyes turned towards Alice. "I'm not 1 mile high," said Alice. "Yes, you are," said the king. "I think she's 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now. I saw you." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "If it's the oldest rule," said Alice, "then why isn't it rule number 1? The king turned pale at this and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict, jury," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "There's more evidence to come yet, please, your majesty," said the white rabbit. He jumped up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What's in it then?" said the queen. "I haven't opened it yet," said the white rabbit. "But I think it's a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, "unless it was written to nobody, which isn't all that unusual, you know." "Who is it directed to?" asked one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the white rabbit. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, "This isn't a letter at all. It looks like a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" asked another of the jurymen. "No, they're not," said the white rabbit. "And that's the strangest thing about this." The jury looked equally puzzled. "He must have imitated somebody else's hand," said the king. The jury nodded. They looked like they agreed. "Please, your majesty," said the knave, "I didn't write this, and they can't prove it. There's no name signed at the end." "Well, if you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd signed your name like an honest man." There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said all day. "I think it proves his guilt," said the queen. No, it proves nothing of the sort, said Alice. Why, we haven't read it yet. You don't even know what it says. Okay then, said the king. Read them then. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin? Please, your majesty, he asked. Begin at the beginning, the king said gravely, and go on until you come to the end, and then stop. These were the verses the White Rabbit read. They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent the word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her one. They gave him two. You gave us three or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been an obstacle that came between him and ourselves, and it seems. Don't let them know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest. Between yourself and me, and no one else. No one else will ever see. The king looked very solemn. That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet. He rubbed his hands together. Now let the jury. If any one of them can explain this, said Alice, though she had grown so large in the last few minutes that now she was not afraid of interrupting him. If any one can explain this, she repeated, I'll give him 6 pence. I don't believe there's anything in there. There's no meaning to this. The jury wrote down on their slates, she doesn't believe in this or the meaning of it. But none of them attempted to explain the verses. If there's no meaning in it, said the king, that saves us a world of trouble, and we needn't try to find any trouble for no reason. Although yet, I don't know, he went on. He spread the verses out on his knee, and he looked at them askance. I seem to see some meaning in them after all, he said. Said I could not swim. That's one of the verses. You can't swim, can you? He added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like I could swim? He said, which he certainly did not, thought Alice, being that he was a card made entirely out of cardboard. All right, so far, said the king, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself. We know it to be true. That means the jury, of course. I gave her one. They gave him two. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, I think. But it goes on, said Alice. They all returned from him to you. Why, there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. Nothing can be more clear than this. Then again, before she had this fit. That line. You never had fits, my dear, I think, he said to the queen. Never, said the queen furiously. She threw an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little lizard, named Bill, had left off writing on his slate with one finger, as he found it made no mark. But he now hastily began again, using the ink thrown at him, because it was trickling down his face and would last for a short while. Then the words don't fit you, said the king. He looked around the court with a smile. There was a dead silence in the room. I think it's a pun, the king added, although he said this as slightly offended, and everyone laughed. Let the jury consider their verdict now, the king said. For about the 20th time that day, thought Alice. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. Hold your tongue, girl, said the queen. Her face began turning purple. I will not, said Alice. Off with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved, for Alice was now a giant. Who cares for you, said Alice. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this, the whole pack rose up into the air, and they came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off. And as she found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. Wake up, Alice, dear, said her sister. Why, what a long sleep you had. Oh, I've had such a curious dream, said Alice. She was so confused how she had gotten back. And she told her sister, as well as she could remember, all of these strange adventures of hers that you have been hearing about today. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her and said, It was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run into your tea. It's getting late. So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream she had had in Wonderland. But her sister sat still, just as she had left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all of her wonderful adventures, until she too began dreaming, after a fashion. And this was her dream. First, she dreamed of little Alice herself, and once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers. She could hear the very tones of her voice and see that strange little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still, as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal. and the shrill voice of the queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution, off with their heads. Once more, the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed all around them. And once more the shriek of the griffin, the squeaking of the lizard slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs. This filled the air, and all was mixed up with the distant sobs of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland as well, though she knew she had but to open her eyes again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would be only rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby from the pepper, the shriek of the griffin, and all of the other strange noises would change. She knew this to be sure. They would change to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the after time, be herself a grown woman one day, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland from long ago, and how she would feel from all their simple sorrows, and find pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days of Wonderland. The end. And that, my dear darling, is the end of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Thank you so much for listening. Sweet and creepy dreams, my darling.